The Last of Us Part 2 is easily one of the most frustrating games I've ever played. On the one hand, it's a 10 of a marvel, easily up there with Arkham Knight, Red Dead 2, Uncharted 4, and The Witcher 3 as one of the best looking games I've ever played. The gameplay, though not quite the massive leap seen from Uncharted 3 to Uncharted 4, is still a step up from the original. It seems silly to say thanks for a dodge button, but it was something that was sorely missed in the first game. The music, when it's present at any rate, is solid, with tracks like Beyond Desolation and the titular track both being standouts. However, this is a modern day Naughty Dog game. Games which pride themselves not just on their technical prowess, but their narrative quality, and it is here where The Last of Us Part 2 falls apart. The events that transpire aren't necessarily the issue, but rather it's their placement in the story. Joel's death at the beginning of the game elicited absolutely no reaction to me. How could the death of one of my favorite characters in all of media make me feel nothing? Simply put, it wasn't played for emotions, but for shock, because it was put far too early in the story for it to have proper emotional resonance. Whatever emotions felt in his death scene are not a result of Part 2 and solely a result of Part 1. This is even more damning given what we learned later about the relationship between Joel and Ellie, how they had ultimately drifted apart and only the night prior was set on rekindling their relationship. It could have been a proper gut punch that galvanizes the player to go on a hunt for Abby within its own narrative instead of relying on our emotions from the previous game's narrative. Moreover, the opening sequence in Jackson and Ellie's story as a whole in Seattle felt like the third act reorganized to be the introduction solely so we could be shocked at Joel's death. I have no problem with Joel dying or even playing as someone who he has wronged, but the game would rather be in service of its theme of revenge than the more interesting story it lays out in the flashbacks, that being the repercussions of Joel's lie. Part 2 utilizes non-linear narrative, a narrative structure in which events are portrayed out of chronological order or in other ways where the narrative does not follow the direct causality pattern of the events featured. This is the definition most applicable to this game, and it's the one I'll be using as the basis for this critique. Inherently, there is nothing wrong with non-linear storytelling. I can name a few films which have done it very well. But there was also this little played DLC not many people heard of for The Last of Us called Left Behind, which also utilized non-linear structure to great effect. Set during the main game, it follows Ellie as she combs through a dilapidated mall to find medicine for Joel, while we also get flashbacks to the time she and her best friend and crush Riley went to a similar mall in Boston, which led to the discovery of Ellie's immunity and the death of Riley, something which was only touched on in bits of dialogue throughout and at the end of the main game. It's an emotional and poignant addition to the main story, and the structure allows us to understand where Ellie's head is at during this time, her motivation for keeping Joel alive, and the memories that a location can elicit. If that wasn't enough, Uncharted 4, a game which I consider a masterpiece and the best of its series, also heavily utilized non-linear storytelling, juxtaposing Sam and Nate's hunt for Henry Avery's treasure in the present with their adventures as children, which culminated in them taking the last name of Sir Francis Drake, honoring a theory their dead mother held about Drake having numerous illegal heirs to his fortune. Again, it works to great effect, showing how far the two brothers have come in their life, and it brings the story of the series as a whole full circle. All of that said, it's clear that it wasn't the right decision when structuring the narrative for Part 2 because, as I said earlier, nothing hits on an emotional level. It only ever shocks you momentarily. Shock value can only carry a story so far. It must also have emotional resonance behind it in order for it to be effective and long-lasting. That is something that Left Behind and Uncharted 4 excelled at, and it's something that Part 2 denies itself through its non-linear structure. The writing is there, somewhat. Rewrites would not have got amiss, particularly in the Abby section, but the structure absolutely isn't. So to summarize, non-linear storytelling as a whole is not bad, and it has been done effectively in this series and by this writer, but in this particular narrative, it saps out pretty much all of the emotional resonance. It's very clear what this game is trying to do. It wants the Abby-love relationship to be an analog for the Ellie-Joel relationship from the first game, a hardened killer reconnecting with their humanity. It wants the Ellie story to be an analog for what Abby went through the years leading up to killing Joel, with Ellie's PTSD in the epilogue functioning the same role as the nightmares experienced by Abby in the main story, that being the catalyst for her self-destructive path of revenge that does not bring her the inner peace she thought it would. But the stories are so far removed from each other that them being told separate of one another makes them not hit their intended marks. Once Ellie has the PTSD, I can see that my 13 hours with Ellie reminds echo the flashback sequences with Abby, and that the rest of the epilogue will echo the Seattle sections with Abby. But my only thought when I came to that realization was, oh, okay, that's kind of interesting, but not well executed. And I looked at the game's structure, wishing it had properly pulled a Halo 2. Though it may not seem like it, Halo 1 and 2 actually have a lot in common with The Last of Us 1 and 2. Allow me to explain. Halo Combat Evolved is a very simple narrative with an inspired setting that sets it apart from its contemporaries in a crowded genre. Halo 2 is a much more ambitious narrative, which makes you see the perspective of the bad guy who was wronged by the protagonist's actions in the first game and holds a deep-seated grudge against that protagonist, and that even though they are a bad guy, they are not a bad guy. Sound familiar? Now obviously there are some differences. Halo 2's narrative is about expanding the lore of the Covenant, how they operate, and what their society is like and what their beliefs really entail, whereas Part 2 is a story about revenge and redemption in which the factions are pretty much secondary to its narrative. In this way, Part 2 is a bit like Combat Evolved, but in terms of being a sequel with a grander narrative that wants to recontextualize the player's actions in the previous game and do the whole everyone is the hero of their own story shtick, it's a lot like Halo 2. It also harbors a major similarity to Halo 2 in and of having the player experience 50% of the game as its secondary protagonist, who happens to be an antagonist, that being the Arbiter. Now at first, players rejected it.
Wait a minute, you gotta play as the bad guys? No, turn this game off. I don't want to turn this off.
But, being the clever nerds they are, Bungie anticipated this, and in a move of genius has the player alternate control of the two characters, utilizing parallel story structure. So while level 1 is Chief, level 2 is the Arbiter. Bungie basically baited players with Chief's story. If you want to continue the story you're here for, you're gonna have to play through these Arbiter levels.
Alright, I'll play.
However, as the story goes on, you grow to really like this Arbiter dude. It's like,
you are a bad guy, but this does not mean you're a bad guy.
And you understand why he would want to kill the Master Chief. That scene in the beginning begins to be even more impactful the longer you play. And when the twist is dropped that everyone is just a pawn in the Prophet's game and the Greek journey is a lie, you actually feel bad for him. Arbiter and Chief meeting is a scene that is exciting not because of the huge Venus flytrap, but because these two dope characters have finally crossed paths. Rather than have us play the first half of the game as Chief and the next half as Arbiter, Bungie realized that they had to win over the player and make them want to play the Arbiter and continue the story just as much as Chief's. Despite the initial hesitation, we grow to like him so much that the game is able to end its campaign with him. This is something The Last of Us Part 2 could have learned from. See, the overarching problem with the structure is that it neither gets us to care about Joel and Ellie's relationship within this narrative, but it also fails at getting us to care for the secondary protagonist, Abby, and her crew. In my completionist playthrough, Ellie's section lasted 13 hours and Abby's section lasted for 9 hours. This structure kills all the momentum built up in the Ellie section, and it never recovers as Abby's section is wholly unrelated to Ellie's hunt. By the time you get back to the theater, you are so far removed from the events of Ellie's story that I am not at all conflicted about going into said theater because there has been no real build-up. Ellie and company conveniently leave the map that marks their location on it. Abby finds it when she finds a dead Owen and dead Mel, and we go to the theater. It almost feels half-hearted, as if they wrote it and then remember that she has to confront Ellie in the theater. However, had the game pulled a Halo 2, it could have been very impactful. Imagine, the last you saw of Ellie was that she's killed Owen and Mel, and for the duration of the next Abby section, you're waiting for her to find out, and when she does, and she finds a conveniently placed map, it's an oh no moment, rather than an alright, move along moment. Walking into the theater, it would be wrenching. You know what's about to happen, but you don't want it to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Instead of jumping between flashbacks and present day and segmenting the two stories, let's linearize and integrate the two stories. The goal here is to make the audience sympathize for Abby and company and Ellie and company within the context of this narrative. The writing in the Ellie section is by and large there, so a simple rearrangement is all that's really required. However, Abby's section is at what I call a baseline level. It barely gets the job done, and honestly, it could go for a few more drafts, but we will cross that bridge when we get there. When we place the events chronologically, the game starts with us playing as Abby. At first, players would be somewhat confused as to why we were playing as her, but once we see that hospital, it all comes together. By moving the sequence to the beginning, we are able to sympathize with Abby the same way we sympathize with Joel in the first game, both losing the person they held dearest to them by means beyond their control. While there is still the matter of Abby never seeing Joel kill her father, we would still be sympathetic to her rather than how it turned out in the final game.
I get, yeah, sucks to get your dad killed,
Worth
but
it, though?
I guess for us to sympathize, I expected a bit more.
As mentioned earlier, Abby is supposed to be the Joel of this game. Her story of a kind person turned killer by losing a loved one, only to be redeemed by a child who shows him the beauty still in this bleak world, is the same as his story from the first game.
Again, it's like poetry, so if they rhyme.
So having this be the opener would instantly cement that parallel in people's minds, and leading right into Joel giving his account of the events, Part 2 would seamlessly pull off the everyone's the hero of their own story shtick, and have us feel for Abby within the first 30 minutes. Moreover, we get to see the deterioration of Ellie and Joel's relationship from where we left it in The Last of Us.
I do okay.
Are you fucking kidding me?
To doubt.
You said there were dozens of people like me. I've never met another immune person before. Have you?
To disbandment.
Don't you fucking touch me! I'll go back. But we're done.
All the while juxtaposing it to Abby's inability to let go of that desire for revenge and the strain that it puts on her relationship with Owen.
I know all the leads have dried up. But Joel's still out there, you know?
Ultimately leading to them being apart despite how much they both cared for each other.
Dating life's good.
For the most part, yeah. She can be really sweet.
Must feel nice after me.
Seeing Abby get the go-ahead for her revenge trip, followed by Joel and Ellie deciding to fix their relationship, makes the next 2 hours have weight not found in the game's current structure. As we play as Abby overlooking Jackson and Ellie going about what she believes is just another day, the audience is on the edge of their seat, hoping that every one of these characters makes it out okay. When Abby gets caught up in the affected herd and she's saved by Joel and Tommy, the tension will get ratcheted up to 11, and that doesn't stop until they get to the mansion and Abby begins to torture Joel. Rather than purely shocking the audience, this is a gut punch, a worst fear brought to realization. It makes running into the house even more urgent because you know Abby and you know what she's gonna do and she's gonna kill Joel, and for a moment you think you can stop it. There's a moment before heading out to Seattle where you go into Joel's house and find his bulldog pistol. This is the moment that planted the idea for me to do this essay because it almost brought a tear to my eye. Almost. Picking up things like the pamphlet from the museum reinforced what I already felt. This was out of order. Ellie holding that pamphlet could have been gutting as the player remembers that level and that relationship that was lost and could have been again only for it to be taken from them. As she finds the guitars and his jackets and everything Joel all around, the player would get even more emotional and we would functionally be in the same headspace as Ellie and reinforce where Abby was at after Joel killed her father. Placing this moment after Joel's story is done, after we will never see him again, really galvanizes the player to go into the third act, to want to hunt Abby beyond the shock value behind his death. It also makes playing as Abby properly conflicting. You knew it was coming and now you must continue her story. It is here where we get to parallel the journey of revenge Ellie is currently on with the revenge journey Abby was on and how it will ultimately not bring her any peace. It makes the Abby section relevant in a way that it isn't within its current structure. It keeps the themes and character drama at the forefront rather than having 3 days of Ellie and then 3 days of Abby and having them so far removed from each other that any impact is menial at best and negligible at worst. As mentioned multiple times, the equivalency between Joel and Abby is a major part of this story, but in the current structure it just feels weird that Abby is supposed to be the top scar killer, yet is willing to help out these sworn enemies and find humanity in them. Having the story crescendo with Joel's death and having the rest of the game be the falling action really allows for the audience to understand the headspace of Abby. Once we see the nightmare, we know that revenge hasn't brought her peace, and it makes the Ellie sections all the more impactful because she is now on that hunt and it won't bear her any fruit. Part of the impact is seeing Abby's friends get killed one by one, reinforcing the idea that revenge can ultimately backfire. No death is supposed to drive this home more than Owen and Mel. Now, from what I understand, mostly everyone agrees that the side characters in the Abby sections all kinda suck, due in no small part due to their role in Joel's death. This is another aspect of the game that's at a baseline level. Every member of the crew was a Firefly and they all want revenge on Joel for wiping them out. I doubt this was intentional. They obviously really want you to feel bad about these characters' deaths, but the structure doesn't allow it. When you're playing as Abby, you already know the outcome. Spoilers, they die. Failing that, there is one character they really want you to feel for, and that's Owen. I think Owen is the only one of the new characters who I didn't want to be torn apart by a pack of clickers. He seems like an alright dude who just wants to move on with his life, a life like everyone else in this world that is marked by tragedy. His death is meant to be another gut punch, but given the game's current structure, I felt absolutely nothing, even with the ancillary information. Too late. Also, side note, Mel? Really? That's the best you could do? Anyway, by utilizing parallel structure, we get to see the effects that wanting and getting revenge take on Owen, the person closest to Abby, and her love interest, while also seeing how it's impacting Dina, Ellie's love interest. So when Ellie kills Owen, the audience should be shocked instead of ambivalent, because if the stories are analogous, that means Dina and everyone else Ellie holds dear are back in the crosshairs. Abby was gonna leave with Owen for Santa Barbara, but Ellie continued to hunt despite the chances for her to get out of it, and now it will literally lead revenge to her front door. I've neglected talking about Tommy and Jesse and the majority of the side stuff up to this point because while they play a non-negligible role, I wanted to focus on the A story of the game and not the background noise, hence my virtual omission of the Scars vs. WLF subplot. But it is here in the theater where the importance to the story lies. Ellie had the chance to give up on the hunt, but she couldn't shake the feeling for revenge, and now it's going to cost her. Sound like anybody you know? I hate to draw comparisons to Abby's crew because they suck, but Jesse and Tommy and Mel and Manny serve the same function. They are people with whom the protagonist has a long-standing relationship with and who will ultimately be punished as a result of the protagonist's actions. Jesse is the former lover of Dina and the father to her child, and, as we learn in one of the flashbacks, someone Joel thinks Ellie had a crush on, making him another part of Joel's memory.
I hear the way Jesse talks about you.
No, Jesse and I are just friends.
No, I've got a pretty keen eye for these sort of things.
Not so keen with this one.
We'll see.
This is not unlike Mel, with the differences being that A, Abby isn't with Owen, Mel is the rebound, and B, Abby and Mel kinda hate each other. Mel tells Abby at one point that she's a garbage person, so they aren't exactly cool with each other.
I haven't always done the right thing.
You're a piece of shit, Abby.
Conversely, Jesse and Ellie are cool with each other and are pretty friendly.
Joel liked you a lot too, you know. He used to think I had a crush on you.
Really?
I mean, you're handsome and whatever, but I'm not into your type.
What, Asians?
Yeah, that's obviously what I meant.
Manny is like Tommy because they both have man buns. I kid, but in reality, the similarities come down to them both being really violent when they see red. When Joel's killed in the mansion, Manny is ready to kill Ellie as well, not wanting to leave anyone standing. Something we see echoed with Tommy when we find the remnants of his rampage, a rampage which eventually leads to Manny's death. By restructuring the game, these parallels are made all the more clear, and they would ultimately make the theater conversation very tense. Playing as Abby as we walk into the theater, I'd say we cut to playing as Abby after Jesse finishes talking. We know what's gonna happen, but because we like these characters, it makes Abby's actions almost as conflicting as when she killed Joel. Now in the current iteration of this boss fight, this is what I did. Do it. This fight did hit its intended mark for some.
Oh no! You're fully gonna make me do this as Abby. Shit, this is conflicting. I don't want to do this at all.
But for the majority, it fell flat because they simply don't care about Abby.
You little boss. I hate that I have to do this to you. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Cool with it. And roll credits.
But by making me see the story through her eyes and paralleling it to Ellie's, you at the very least understand Abby's motivation and why she would do what she's done. It wouldn't feel as contrived, it would feel more organic, more like she wants revenge and she's going to get it however she can because she has lost everything, ironically because of her inability to let go and move on. The moment where she would decide to kill Dina would confirm what Mel had said earlier.
You're a piece of shit, Abby.
But also, it's not entirely misplaced, that sort of Hammurabi's Code situation. Pregnant Mel killed by Ellie, pregnant Dina killed by Abby. While it's absolutely a villainous decision, it's one the audience can understand, rather than how it comes off in the final game where it seems like she's just evil because, you know, you don't like or sympathize with the character. Also because Ellie didn't know Mel was pregnant, but anyway. When Lev keeps Abby from killing Dina, the audience can breathe a sigh of relief because it shows that the humanity has broken through to her. The cycle of violence is now functionally broken. Ellie gets to live with Dina and somehow Tommy and return home and raise their baby. And Abby and Lev leave Seattle to go find the remnants of the Fireflies. While restructuring works for the main story, the epilogue is, ironically enough, told in a linear fashion and it is a disaster.
This is a disaster!
I say this because Ellie John wicks her way through Santa Barbara, hoping that Abby hasn't been killed by the litany of infected in the area, only to let Abby leave and not gut her like a fish. It makes absolutely no sense, even when you just restructure the game. I'd argue there is only one way to have it make one iota of sense, and that is to change the flashback Ellie gets in the final fight. Side note, ripping the boss fight from Lost Legacy for this game? Not cool, Naughty Dog. Instead of having the flashback be Joel on the porch the night she decided to forgive him, flashback to JJ, Dina, and Tommy, and then Mel, Owen, and Lev. Ellie still has a family to go back to. She can still live her life. It wasn't wholly ripped from her despite losing Joel. Compare that to Abby, who is emaciated and at her lowest point. The fireflies and love are all she has, whereas Ellie can still live the life given to her by Joel's decision not to let her die at the end of part 1. It reinforces Ellie forgiving Joel and, moreover, the need to move on with your life and not dwell on events you can't change the outcome of. This is a much more emotional way of doing it in contrast to how it's done in the final game. This also makes the final shot of her leaving the guitar in the windowsill all the more impactful, reinforcing that Ellie is ready to move on with her life. Metaphorically, she's laying Joel to rest. The lessons she learned from him and the lessons she learned from this game are ones that she will carry for the rest of her life, a life she almost threw away in the pursuit of revenge. I think it's important to reiterate that I don't hate this game, I'm just really frustrated with it. I enjoyed playing it, I love the world of this series, and I didn't outright hate the story. In many ways I liked some of the things it tried to do, but I felt it could have been done significantly stronger, and that prompted me to write down my thoughts and make this video. Make no mistake, the game worked for some people. Nathan Ved has this really well made video essay where he is 100% good with how the game turned out, and he cites the structure as part of that. In fact, that video is part of the reason I went ahead and bought a copy of the game, because he makes some interesting and valid points. For me, the game feels disjointed, like it rearranged events for shock value, and it made the flashbacks infuriating because in them lies The Last of Us Part 2 people wanted. But rather than giving it to players and then going about telling the story they wanted, earning players' attentions and willingness to go in this different direction, Druckmann and company do this weird non-linear structure that just shocks and annoys players. It feels more in service of a theme than a satisfying narrative.
What will you learn? What will you learn? That your actions have consequences!
The game isn't hard to understand, but I feel that the delivery is convoluted and messy. I think there are a few reasons for this, mainly the fact that Part 2 is not dissimilar from Druckmann's original story for The Last of Us Part 1, in which Tess would hunt Joel for the duration of the game for betraying her on a mission. She would ultimately capture and torture him after he delivered Ellie to the Fireflies, and Ellie would in turn end up finding and saving Joel. This idea was shot down by his partner in crime, Bruce Straley, who stated that revenge for that duration of time was a weak motivator. I think he never let go of this original idea, and now the vice president of the studio, and coming off of 2 home runs, he revisited it. As far as getting attached to an original idea you had for something goes, I can actually relate to that a bit. If you go on my channel, you'll see a short film titled Murder on Maple Street, which was directed and edited by yours truly. It's a mess. In large because I wasn't malleable. I was attached to the earlier version of the script that I liked, and when given the opportunity I crafted that film when the footage wasn't there. I got tunnel vision and the final version suffered because of it. It's well documented that the final game we got went through substantial rewrites. At one point Abby's father was killed by Joel back in his Hunter days, for example. It's clear that they didn't take this story lightly, but in the same breath I feel like after a certain number of changes were made, they decided not to change anymore because they needed to ship the game before the launch of the PlayStation 5. I take this detour to gut my own work because I think creatives need to be malleable. Getting too attached to your ideas is never good, and I say that as someone who has done that. Sometimes these changes are needed even when it's in the end game. I don't say this to attack Naughty Dog, though there were some less than scrupulous things going on. A lot of things like Lev are really well handled. I commend them for telling an actual mature story, and it does make me glad to see a story take itself seriously. But the game as a whole just never hit for me, and based on all the internet noise and sales figures, I'm not alone. I was left feeling very little, and when I look back at it, it's because the game is structured in a way that it never earned my emotional investment. It banked so hard on my love of the first game, and didn't properly use the first game as a launching point for a new narrative that earns its emotional resonance because of the events that transpire within it. That's not to say the writing is perfect. I'd argue the writing for the Abby section is what does the game in, kills it if I wanted to be hyperbolic, but had it been structured as I've just laid out, I think the game would have overcome the majority of its writing flaws and been a more impactful and emotional experience. And as far as I'm concerned, that's how a bad story structure crippled The Last of Us Part 2.